in the Talbot School of Theology at Biola University in La Mirada, California. Dr. Craig holds PhDs in both philosophy and theology and has published prolifically in both fields, including something on the order of 30 books. He's a veteran of the public debating circuit in the United States and has crossed swords with, among others, Richard Carrier, Bart Ehrman, Sam Harris, and the late Christopher Hitchens.
And me.
Our other speaker, further away, is Professor Lawrence Krauss, Foundation Professor in the School of Earth and Space Exploration at Arizona State University in Phoenix, Arizona. Professor Krauss has a PhD from MIT, and his extensive list of publications include the best-selling books The Physics of Star Trek and A Universe from Nothing. He's well known as a researcher, educator and public commentator, and is one of the stars of the recent film The Unbelievers. I now call upon Professor Craig to deliver his initial statement.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here this evening, and I want to begin by thanking the City Bible Forum for the opportunity to participate in this extraordinary series of 3 dialogues with Lawrence Krauss. And I want to thank in particular Dr. Krauss for his participation in the dialogues. They have been spirited, to say the least. And thank you to Graham Oppie as well. It's an honor to have such an eminent philosopher as our moderator this evening. Now, the question before us this evening is whether it's reasonable to believe that God exists. I'm going to interpret this question to mean, are there better arguments for God's existence than against God's existence? As a professional philosopher, I think that there are many good arguments for God's existence. So in my opening statement, let me just sketch several of the arguments that I'm prepared to discuss with Dr. Krauss tonight. Number 1, God is the best explanation of the origin of the universe. Atheists have typically maintained that the universe is eternal and uncreated. But we now have pretty strong evidence that the universe is not eternal in the past, but had an absolute beginning a finite time ago. In 2003, Arvin Bord, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin were able to prove that any universe, which is on average in a state of cosmic expansion throughout its history, cannot be infinite in the past, but must have a past space-time boundary. Their theorem implies that the quantum vacuum state, which may have characterized the early universe, cannot be eternal in the past, but must have had an absolute beginning. Even if our universe is just a tiny part of a so-called multiverse composed of many universes, their theorem requires that the multiverse itself must have an absolute beginning. Of course, highly speculative scenarios have been proposed to try to avoid this absolute beginning. These models are fraught with problems, but the bottom line is that none of these theories, even if true, succeeds in restoring an eternal past. Last year, at a conference at Cambridge celebrating the 70th birthday of Stephen Hawking, Vilenkin delivered a paper entitled, "Did the Universe Have a Beginning?" which surveyed current cosmology with respect to that question. He argued, and I quote, "None of these scenarios can actually be past eternal." He concluded, "All the evidence we have says that the universe had a beginning." But then the inevitable question arises. Why did the universe come into being? What brought the universe into existence? There must have been a transcendent cause which brought the universe into being. We can summarize our argument thus far as follows. 1, the universe began to exist. 2, if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a transcendent cause. 3, therefore, the universe has a transcendent cause. Now, by the very nature of the case, that cause must be a transcendent, non-spatiotemporal, immaterial being. Now, there are only two types of things that could possibly fit that description. Either an abstract object, like a number, or else an unembodied mind or consciousness. But abstract objects can't cause anything. The number 7, for example, has no effect on anything. It follows, therefore, that the cause of the universe is plausibly an unembodied mind. And thus we are brought not merely to the first uncaused cause of the universe, but to its personal creator. Number 2, God is the best explanation of the applicability of mathematics to the physical world. Philosophers and scientists have puzzled over what physicist Eugene Wigner called the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. How is it that a mathematical theorist like Peter Higgs can sit down at his desk and by poring over mathematical equations, predict the existence of a fundamental particle which 30 years later, after investing millions of dollars and thousands of man-hours, experimentalists are finally able to detect? Mathematics is the language of nature. But how is this to be explained? If mathematical objects are abstract entities causally isolated from the universe, then the applicability of mathematics is, in the words of philosopher of mathematics Mary Lang, just a happy coincidence. On the other hand, if mathematical objects are just useful fictions, then how is it that nature is written in the language of these fictions? The atheist has no explanation for the uncanny applicability of mathematics to the physical world. By contrast, the theist has a ready explanation. When God created the physical universe, he designed it on the mathematical structure that he had in mind. We can summarize this argument as follows. 1, if God did not exist, the applicability of mathematics would be just a happy coincidence. 2, but the applicability of mathematics is not just a happy coincidence. 3, it therefore follows that God exists. Number 3, God is the best explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. In recent decades, scientists have been stunned by the discovery that the initial conditions given in the Big Bang were fine-tuned for the existence of intelligent life with a precision and delicacy that literally defy human comprehension. This fine-tuning is of two sorts. First, when the laws of nature are expressed as mathematical equations, you find appearing in them certain constants, like the gravitational constant. The values of these constants are independent of the laws of nature. Second, in addition to these constants, there are certain arbitrary quantities, which are just put in as initial conditions on which the laws of nature operate. For example, the amount of entropy in the universe. Now, all of these constants and quantities fall into an extraordinarily narrow range of life-permitting values. Were these constants or quantities to be altered by less than a hair's breadth, the life-permitting balance would be destroyed and life would not exist anywhere in the cosmos. Now, there are 3 live explanatory options for this extraordinary fine-tuning: physical necessity, chance, or design. Physical necessity is not, however, a plausible explanation, because the finely tuned constants and quantities are independent of the laws of nature. Therefore, they are not physically necessary. So, could the fine-tuning be due to chance? Well, the problem with this explanation is that the odds of a life-permitting universe governed by our laws of nature are just so infinitesimal that they cannot be reasonably faced. Therefore, the proponents of chance have been forced to resort to a remarkable metaphysical hypothesis, namely the existence of a world ensemble of other universes, preferably infinite in number and randomly ordered, so that life-permitting universes would appear by chance somewhere in the ensemble. Not only is this hypothesis, to quote Richard Dawkins, an unparsimonious extravagance, but it faces an insuperable objection. There is no reason to think that most of the observable worlds in a world ensemble would be finely tuned worlds, rather than worlds in which, for example, a single brain fluctuates into existence out of the vacuum and observes its otherwise empty world. Thus, if our world were just a random member of a world ensemble, we ought to be having observations like that. Since we don't, that strongly disconfirms the world ensemble hypothesis. So chance is also not a plausible explanation. It follows that design is the best explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe. Thus, the fine-tuning of the universe constitutes evidence for a cosmic designer. Number 4, God is the best explanation of objective moral values and duties in the world. In moral experience, we apprehend a realm of moral values and duties which impose themselves upon us as objectively binding and true. For example, we all recognize that it's wrong to walk into an elementary school with an automatic weapon and shoot little boys and girls and their teachers. On a naturalistic view, however, there's nothing objectively wrong about this. Moral values are just the subjective byproducts of biological evolution and social conditioning. The atheist philosopher Alex Rosenberg is brutally honest about the implications of atheism. He declares, there is no such thing as morally right or wrong. Individual human life is meaningless and without ultimate moral value. We need to face the fact that nihilism is true. By contrast, the theist grounds objective moral values in God and our moral duties in his commands. The theist thus has the explanatory resources which the atheist lacks to ground objective moral values and duties. Hence, we may argue, 1, objective moral values and duties exist. 2, but if God did not exist, objective moral values and duties would not exist, from which it follows logically 3, therefore God exists. Number 5, God is the best explanation of the historical facts concerning the resurrection of Jesus. Most people think that Jesus' resurrection is something you just believe in by faith or not. But actually, there are 3 facts recognized by the majority of New Testament historians today, which I believe are best explained by the hypothesis of Jesus' resurrection. Namely, the discovery of his empty tomb on the Sunday morning following his crucifixion. 2, the appearances of Jesus alive after his death to various individuals and groups. And 3, his disciples suddenly and sincerely coming to believe that God raised him from the dead. And I'll be happy to discuss in detail any of these during our dialogue. Attempts to explain away these 3 great facts, like the disciples stole the body or Jesus wasn't really dead, have been universally rejected by contemporary scholarship. The simple fact is that there just is no plausible, naturalistic explanation of these 3 facts. And therefore, it seems to me the Christian is amply justified in believing that the best explanation of the evidence is that Jesus rose from the dead and therefore was who he claimed to be. But that entails that the God who raised Jesus from the dead exists. And thus we have a good inductive argument for the existence of God based on the resurrection of Jesus. Finally, number 6, God can be personally known and experienced. This isn't really an argument for God's existence. Rather, it's the claim that you can know that God exists wholly apart from arguments simply by personally experiencing him. Philosophers call beliefs like this properly basic beliefs. They aren't based on some other beliefs. Rather, they're part of the foundation of a person's system of beliefs. Other properly basic beliefs would be belief in the reality of the past or the existence of the external world. In the same way, belief in God is, for those who seek him, a properly basic belief grounded in our experience of God. Now, if this is the case, then there's a danger that arguments for God could actually distract your attention from God himself. The Bible promises, draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. We mustn't so concentrate on the external arguments that we fail to hear the inner voice of God speaking to our own hearts. For those who listen, God becomes a personal reality in their lives. In summary, then, we've seen 6 respects in which God provides a better explanation of the world than atheism. God is the best explanation of the origin of the universe. God is the best explanation of the applicability of mathematics to the physical world. God is the best explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. God is the best explanation of objective moral values and duties in the world. God is the best explanation of the historical facts concerning the resurrection of Jesus. And finally, God can be personally known and experienced. In our conversation to follow, I'm happy to discuss any and all of these arguments with Professor Krauss.
Thank you, Dr. Craig. I now call on Professor Krauss to give his initial statement.
Before I actually begin my presentation, I want to, echo the thanks of Dr. Craig. In many ways, I want to really, let's just see if all this all works now. Let's just see if my remote works. There we go. Okay, good. I want to thank the City Bible Forum. The people have been incredible to me and gracious, honorable, much to my surprise, and really charming. And I want to thank Peter and Robin and Emma, Craig in the back. And Robin today, I want to thank him also. It's the second time they've done this for me, and I want to mention it. I have a little bit of Black Label Johnny Walker whiskey here in honor of my late friend Christopher Hitchens, which was provided for me by the City Bomb. And as I pointed out the other day in Sydney, that is a vast difference between Australia and the United States. It would never happen that a Christian group would provide me with whiskey before a talk. So I really do want to thank them, and I think they all deserve a round of applause for doing such a great job. I really do. Okay. So obviously you know the question. Well, the answer to the question is kind of obvious. We could get out of here quickly. It's no, but certainly if numbers matter, it's definitely not reasonable to believe in God. You know, humans created lots of gods over their history. Every single thing that happened to humans involved a god at some point or another over the time, the sun, the moon, the planets, the winds, the oceans. There have been over at least estimates of 1,000 different gods over human history, okay? And there are lots of names, and we've gotten rid of them. Dr. Craig doesn't believe in them. Almost all of them, but one. So it's just a difference of one. He's an atheist about all these other gods for good reason. That we've gotten rid of them because we now understand how the universe works, and we understand those stories are just stories that are inconsistent with the way the universe works. It's rational inquiry and physical understanding that has done that. I mean, the example that it reminds me of is, people don't, when it's not raining, you could pray for rain, or you can go to a meteorologist, and farmers will in general go to meteorologists now, because it works, and that's the fundamental difference. Now, God is at best irrelevant, and I mean at best irrelevant. Science has gotten rid of God from pretty well everywhere God used to reside. Used to have angels pushing the planets in orbits around the sun. Newton got rid of that. Used to be special creation, as we'll get to this. Every species looked like it was fine-tuned for the conditions in which it lived, meaning there had to be design. Does that argument seem familiar to you? Have you just heard it? Okay, well, that was the argument that was applied to life, but Darwin showed, in fact, natural selection and genetic mutation could easily, in fact, not only could easily, but does explain the diversity of life on Earth. Biochemistry, while we don't yet know the origin of life on Earth, is quickly convincing us that there's no divine spark, nothing difference between animate and inanimate matter except for biochemical processes. And I suspect in the lifetime of almost everyone in this room, given that most of you are younger than us, we will, in fact, learn how chemistry turned into biology. We also learn that even matter can be created and destroyed. Physics has taught us that, and as I've written and we've discussed, we can learn that universes can be created and destroyed, no problem. So many of the things we needed God for are no longer there. But it's worse than that, of course. Why are some people hanging on to that one remaining God? I mean, if you ask yourself, how likely is it, given the complete lack of evidence for any divinity, that Yahweh, or whatever you want to call him, is not, and not one of the other 999 gods that we've dispensed with, how likely it is that one God exists? Well, it's unlikely, given that, the plethora of all the rest don't exist, and Christian apologists would argue against all the rest. Why, given what we know, do we want to apply everything that we don't understand to an invisible man in the sky when there's been no evidence whatsoever that any invisible man in the sky actually exists? And not only that, which invisible man in the sky? Because even in the modern monotheistic religions, there are incredible inconsistencies, and only one of them can be right. In fact, on the stage the other day, I asked Dr. Craig, what about Islam? And of course, he said Islam is wrong. So that invisible man in the sky, who has his own set of values and morals and claims, is inconsistent. So even if you accept this one God, the God depends upon, as you'll see, where you live. But the most important thing is our current understanding of nature has actually changed. We call it learning. It's developed since the claims were first made by peasants, Iron Age peasants, who didn't even know the Earth orbited the sun. We have learned about how the universe works, and that has changed our opinion. And in fact, it's told us that the scriptures are inconsistent with what we know about science, empirical science and reason. So it's completely unreasonable to accept these old explanations because they just don't work. They disagree with the evidence. And finally, there's nothing absolutely new or special about Jesus. He's just as unpleasant as all the other gods, and all the stories of Jesus have occurred elsewhere. Now, in fact, I would argue most people who even call themselves religious choose reason over God. For many reasons. Most people who believe in the Judeo-Christian God don't really believe in most part. The way people are happy to call themselves Christians or Jews, but they pick and choose from the scriptures. They say, well, Jonah didn't live inside a whale. I don't really like the idea that Lot told the people of Sodom, it's okay, rape my daughters because I don't want you to rape the angels. So go rape my daughters because they're just women, and women are chattel, and it's okay. I doubt many Catholics actually believe, in fact, I would be amazed to find any, including priests, who believe that when a priest blesses a wafer, it turns into the body of a first-century Jew. I was on a stage with several people from the Vatican astronomer, and several colleagues of mine, religious Catholics, and I asked them if any of them believed in the virgin birth, and not one of them would say they did. Now, the only thing, as Dr. Craig has pointed out, that seems to have gotten any currency is the resurrection. That's the one thing, and I was just talking to a member of the City Bible Forum who was happy enough to drive me to the airport in Sydney, and I said it was the resurrection that convinced him. And I think for Dr. Craig, it's probably the resurrection. We've already discussed this before. But, the point is, many of my colleagues, when I write a paper, they say, it's wrong, your paper's wrong, and I did it first. And I think that's the point. There's nothing new about a resurrection. It's as old as every God and every creation myth. There's lots of examples. Dionysus and Jesus are so close to being identical. They both were born from a virgin mother. They both had a divine father. They both were resurrected. They both transformed wine into water, etc., etc., etc. Osiris, the Egyptian god of life, death, he would, in fact, the new kingdom, this is almost 2,000 years before Christ, in principle, the idea was that people would be resurrected with Osiris if they followed the correct religious rituals. But the point about the resurrection is that there's no evidence of it. There's no evidence it would pass muster in a science lab, much less a court of law. It's hearsay, stories written based on oral traditions decades or hundreds of years after the fact, which are inconsistent with each other. There's nothing, when Dr. Craig tells me, and I said it before, historians of the Bible, theologians and people, scholars of the Bible, all accept that the resurrection happened. It reminds me of when I debate alien abduction experts who say, well, all alien abduction experts say people were abducted by aliens. Well, that doesn't mean much to me. Given that it's never been observationally verified, is it reasonable to expect that someone comes back from the dead? It's never been observed, never been seen. So is it reasonable to expect that it happened once when no one could see it and when no one actually reported on it at the time? No. In fact, the fact that people may have seen Jesus walking, if they report that, I'm willing to accept their belief that they did. But as Oliver Sacks has described it beautifully in a recent book, hallucinations are real to those people that experience them. Now, the fundamental, Christopher Hitchens really presented the fundamental irrationality of the premise of a savior. We're asked to believe the following. First, that our God created our universe 14 billion years ago, except in many states in my country. And maybe Queensland. But anyway, then he waited almost 10 billion years before the earth formed. Then he waited another 4 billion years until animals evolved. Then, over 2 million years, he watched as our poor hominid ancestors scraped out this meager, miserable existence without intervening. Then waited another 250,000 years as the first Homo sapiens began to assemble into families and tribes beset by hunger and illness, individuals who are genetically identical to us, essentially, and presumably, therefore, have a soul, but who are presumably still suffering through eternity without grace because he chose not to save them. But then, to introduce, after such remarkable negligence, he decided to reveal himself not in an era of video cameras like today, but in an era of Iron Age peasants, in a society at the time beset by myth and superstition, and not once since then. Come on. And worse, the fundamental premise of Christianity is so ridiculous that we are born sick and commanded to be well, as Christopher has said. So, the next aspect of faith and belief in God that's ridiculous is miracles. Now, I once quoted this, and in fact, last time we met outside of this country, Professor Dr. Craig said, well, philosophers don't buy it, but I'd like him to explain to you what's wrong with the argument. Basically, it says if a miracle is something that must be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. I mean, it's so, as Carl Sagan would have said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Or as Fox Mulder would have said, I want to believe. We all want to believe, and we should recognize that, and that's what science teaches us. We are all susceptible immediately to the idea that coincidences are special. Something that happens to us means a lot. And often, that belief resides in the discrepancy between the laws of probability and the workings of cognition. When something happens to you, it seems special. You can have 1,000 dreams that are ridiculous, and one night you dream a friend of yours is going to break their leg, and the next day they break their arm, you go, cosmic. But you forget all the nonsensical dreams. It's a natural tendency. And in science, we have to work against that. Coincidences happen. John Paul is now going to be a saint because some woman had a remission of a disease in 2011. Well, couldn't that just be a coincidence? As Feynman pointed out, the standards of proof in science are so different than those of the Catholic Church. In science, we try to prove ideas wrong as well as right. We don't just try and say, we like this, let's prove it right. And the best example I know, again, comes from Carl Sagan, Miracle at Lourdes. There was this apparition of the Virgin Mary in Lourdes, and many people have gone to bathe in the waters, and the Catholic Church keeps good records of it. And about 128 million pilgrims have gone there, and I think 56 have been cured of diseases, and they can say that they can't prove it's something else. And and therefore they're miraculous. No one's regenerated an arm, but people have been in remission from cancer. But the interesting thing is, there's spontaneous remission rates of cancer in society, and if you actually look, the probability of having a remission from cancer if you go to Lourdes is smaller than that in the general population. But if you go to Lourdes and you come back and your cancer goes into remission, there's no way that I'm going to be able to convince you it's just an accident. And that's the problem of our own cognition in miracles. Now, the other thing that's obvious about what makes it unreasonable is the God that we've created is not the kind of, if you were a God, omnipotent, would you be so petty and jealous? Would you say, hey, let me get you to almost kill your son to see if you believe in me? Okay? Or, you know what? I want you to prostrate before me 5 times a day to show you love me. If you had an ant farm, would you kill the ants if they didn't look up at you every day and tell you how wonderful you were? Okay? It's just kind of, for an omnipotent being, he's pretty petty. Or she. And even Christianity, which is supposed to be this loving religion, says, believe in me or go to hell for all eternity. Gee, thanks. Or, based on here's what I want to do. I'm going to kill my own son and torture him to absolve humanity from original sin associated with a non-existent forebear, Adam. It's nonsense. And if it was reasonable, it wouldn't depend on geography. What you believe depends upon where you come from. It's the U.S., you probably believe in the Bible and Jesus. If it's India, it's probably Brahmin. If it's the Islamic word, you believe in the Quran, it's the perfect word of God, and Muhammad is a prophet. And in fact, you'd have people, I've debated a clone of Dr. Craig's, in an Islamic clone, who uses exactly the same arguments to prove that the Quran is the word of God. The great thing is that the global access to information means that people are now learning that they don't have to accept those things and can think for themselves. And for that reason, religion is monotonically decreasing. That unreasonable belief in God is monotonically decreasing in all of the internet accessible world. Now, science, that Dr. Craig talked about morals. Science develops morals without her being God in this case. I would argue that the worldview guiding the moral and spiritual values of essentially everyone in this room is not a worldview given to us by religion, but a worldview given to us by science. There's no need for God to do the right thing. Reason is what guides you. If you stop believing in God, and if Dr. Craig stopped believing in God, I doubt he would go out and kill his neighbor. Reason guides our actions, and reason based on empirical evidence and knowledge of the world. And in fact, morality evolves over time. In fact, Dr. Craig agreed that in our society, morality evolves over time because we learn things. We get rid of the immoral dogma of the Judeo-Christian religions. The fact that gays are evil. Well, we now know that, in fact, homosexuality is common in all mammals. It's not unnatural. It's absolutely normal. Women are not chattel. Unlike the last pope who's still alive, condoms don't cause AIDS in Africa. In vitro fertilization, allowing people to have children, is not evil. It's good. Now, there are certain universal morals which we can talk about. In my institute, we've talked a lot about them. You can ask, do different cultures have different reactions? And I don't have time to go in it. But they can be overruled. So we have biological responses that are hardwired. But even those can be overruled by reason. And I want to bring up an example which I used with the Islamic guy and offended him incredibly. Maybe it'll offend all of you and Dr. Craig. I don't know. It involves incest. We all have a revulsion, a natural biological revulsion against incest. And there's a good reason. It's a biological taboo. Genetically, sexual reproduction by siblings is bad. And that biological revulsion means we have taboos against it, which then get enfranchised in societies. But I would have to say that let's take the example of a brother and sister, an adult brother and sister, who decide they love one another, decide to have sex, decide to use protection so they won't reproduce. Is that morally wrong? I can't say it is, frankly. Now, the best example that a belief in God is unreasonable is sitting next to me. I've listened to Dr. Craig over the days, and I've changed my opinion. I'm much more charitable. I came here convinced, based on my past interactions in his writing, that Dr. Craig was a dishonest charlatan. But I don't believe that anymore. I think Dr. Craig earnestly believes deeply in the issues he was talking about, so deeply, and as a man of intelligence, He is convinced that there must be a reason he believes that way, and he finds every possible rational argument that he can invent that satisfies him. So any argument that validates God is reasonable to him, and any argument against it is not only unreasonable, but wrong and worth distorting, because it must be wrong. He's decided the answer in advance. And I want to give you some examples. The best example, one of the examples I used before, is this awful aspect of the immorality of the Old Testament, Deuteronomy, where God tells the Israelites to kill all the Canaanite children and women and children and kill everyone in the cities. It's awful. That's the reason we're happy we've gotten rid of that. We don't know, it's in the modern world, we don't appease genocide because we say God did it. Or if a woman drowns her children because she hears God telling her to, there are places for people like that. And Dr. Craig likes children, but in order to validate this, this is what he's written. Why take the lives of innocent children? If we believe, as I do, that God's grace is extended to those who die in infancy or as small children, the death of these children was actually their salvation. God does these children no wrong in taking their lives. So in fact, if they were Canaanite children in that schoolroom that he talked about, it'd be okay. It's worse, though. It becomes more obscene. Who does God wrong in commanding the destruction of the Canaanites? Not the Canaanite adults, because they were bad. Not the children, because they get eternal life. It's the poor Israeli soldiers who had to kill them. They're the ones who are wrong. And then he's gone back and thought about it and says, you know what, I've rethought about it. And really, the real problem is the command was just to drive them out of the land. If they just left, they wouldn't have had to been killed at all. Only those who remained behind were to be utterly exterminated. That's okay. That kind of genocide, rationalizing genocide in that way is not reasonable, but those are the lengths you have to go to. I have about 2 minutes, is that right? Now, what amazes me is that we've had these discussions the last 3 days, and Dr. Craig keeps repeating the same arguments, even when I've showed him that they're wrong, that the science is wrong. He used these arguments, and this is a version of the argument he used today. Item number 2 is, if the universe had an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. This was from his slide before. It's now called transcendence. But let's look at that. I mean, that is one of the silliest, unwarranted statements I can ever imagine. It reminds me of the Sidney Harris cartoon where there's an equation, and in the middle you can see, then a miracle occurs, and the guy says, I think you should be a little more explicit in step 2. I mean, I could replace God by anything in that, by turtles, or Zeus, or quantum mechanics, or better still, unknown. We just don't know it. But what logic is saying, if the universe has an explanation, it must be God? It's total, for a man of his intelligence, it's totally silly. Now, I just threw these things in. He keeps quoting Alex Vilenkin that this theorem works. Alex Vilenkin, wrote me an email after our first debate saying, you know what? It doesn't work when there's quantum gravity. It's not true. It's not even true in the multiverse. But he's so convinced that these arguments must be true, he won't listen to the fact that they're not. Fine-tuning? You've already heard it. Life was fine-tuned. We got rid of it with Darwin. The universe can be involved in natural selection and the fundamental constants if there are a number of universes, for example. But the main point is, just like the fact that you and I are not fine-tuned for our existence, we get backaches because we're not used to designed to be sitting at computers, the universe actually could be tuned much better for life. This argument that it's fine-tuned for life is nonsense. And the last thing, Dr. Craig used 5 syllogisms. The problem with syllogisms is they're only good as the initial postulate. Once you accept that blindly, then you come up with nonsense. Let me give you an example. All mammals exhibit homosexual behavior. William Lane Craig is a mammal. Okay, I think you see where I'm going. It's nonsense. It's nonsense. And it's nonsense because the premise is wrong, and you have to be much more careful in your premise. You can't be so simplistic. And the last thing I will say is that Dr. Craig the other day said the biggest problem for him in terms of understanding and believing in God was the problem of human suffering, and in this case, the suffering of animals. How could a compassionate God let animals suffer? Well, his answer is a compassionate God wouldn't, and therefore they don't. They're not self-aware, and they don't suffer. Now, the point is, and I guess I won't show it. I was going to show these videos. They're kind of remarkable. A group did a video saying, you know what? All the scientists say that all these statements about pain receptors and prefrontal cortex and all the things Dr. Craig was talking about are wrong. Every single scientist. Dr. Craig then did a podcast saying no and distorted it. They responded, and it's kind of amusing to listen to. And maybe I'll post it somewhere. But the point is, the reason Dr. Craig distorted what they say, and as I said, they quoted every scientist, let the scientists see their statements to see if they misrepresent them, is because he believes that a compassionate God would not allow it, and therefore animals must not suffer, independent of the scientific evidence. And that's the problem. So to summarize, by replacing God with reason and empirical inquiry, science provides gifts in return. The universal invitation to question anyone's claims and the universal requirement to exercise due diligence and duty of care to substantiate those claims. What we call reason is testing your ideas against external reality, checking for internal consistency, and then testing again, and using that as the basis of future actions. That's what we call acting rationally. A belief in God doesn't satisfy any of those criteria. And my main goal tonight is not to worry about God, but to encourage the broad use of these gifts.